everybody. Great to be here and great to have you all here with us. So we're going to talk about green tech, investment and the challenges and opportunities within this landscape. I'm Cate from Tech.eu and I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves. David.
Hi everyone, great to be here. David Frykman, General Partner with Norrsken VC. So we're one of Europe's first early stage impact tech investors. And we're now on our third fund and we have about 500 million euros under management and we have a portfolio of 50 plus companies.
Go for it, Steffen.
So yeah, hello everyone, my name is Steffen. I run the biggest angel club in Switzerland. We have like 400 paying members, high net worth individuals, family offices. We supported last year more than 120 startups with an average $500,000 with our community. My background is I worked 20 years in Google, go-to-market strategy across EMEA, and the last years I worked on Project 2030, which I was setting up, and that kind of showed me like that actually in the whole SDG or sustainability space, Europe is in the best spot. I worked with founders around the world, and that was one of the reasons also why I moved on, because like Google is cloud, AI ads, and I believe, I call myself a proud European, Europe is in that space definitely best positioned in the world.
Fantastic. And this is such a divided space when we talk about sustainability and green tech. I know, David, you've invested in some real heavy hitters like 1,5 and Ehrhardt, but we've also seen lately some pretty disappointing failures, like the German eVTOLs, for example, and then we had more recently, we had Northvolt. So what can, I guess, startups in this space learn from those failures? What are the lessons here?
So yeah, Northvolt was a big failure, right? Yeah. So big in all senses, and it was quite devastating, I think, for Europe and for the industry. And I think, so the biggest learning, I think, from a personal perspective at least, is that failure is kind of part of the game. Like we have to be able to live with failure. And it sucks, and it hurts. And it's so hard to stand up after you've been beaten down. But you have to, because there's going to be big failures. If you bet big, you're going to fail big. But that's what we need. Otherwise, we won't change the world or Europe, and we won't have big companies going forward. So we have to be able to do those things and stand up afterwards. And so that, I think, from a personal perspective, is the hardest part. And one thing that I think is the hardest in Europe, that at least in Sweden now, we see a lot of blaming going around, a lot of finger pointing at who was on the board, what did the entrepreneur do, the entrepreneur sold shares and get rich while the company failed, etc. And the learning from that is that it's better to be a journalist and point fingers than actually be the man in the arena fighting the good fight, right? Yeah. Which I think, and here I think the Americans are still better. They have less judgmental view on failure and more of a forgiving attitude that it's actually part of the game and you can learn from it. But I think if we can internalize that, I think that would be the greatest learning you can bring with you. There was a lot of great companies that came out of the dot-com boom.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's going to be the same with Northvolt.
I guess likewise with Nokia, we've seen many companies come out of that.
Exactly.
And, you know, it was a period of time I couldn't go to a conference without meeting ex-Nokia staff. So it shows people are around and people are still creating a flywheel effect, even if that initial company hasn't succeeded.
Exactly.
Which I think is great. And Steffen, I mean, angel investing. I'm starting to hear a lot more noise around angel investing at the moment. So how do you approach investment as opposed to a traditional VC?
I think, like generally speaking, the angel investment ecosystem in Europe is still a bit underdeveloped compared to the US. I always say when you're direct or not, you should have a certain percentage of your assets in early stage investments. And we improved a lot, and UK is definitely better than a lot of other places in Europe. There are a lot of angel clubs around, and I think one aspect they all kind of do is like educating people what it means to do angel investment, that it's not rocket science, that you can enter with a small ticket, and what it really means. And that is something we've seen in our market that has changed a lot over the last years. We do a lot of academy efforts, and it starts to pay off. It's also angel expectations have changed. They're not just want to grab a huge share like of equity from the startup and understand like they will not get a weekly reporting of what's going on in the startup, these kind of things. I think they're really fundamental player for startup to get up and running. Compared to VC, there are also a couple of other aspects. I think you have, specifically in sustainable context, a couple of angels that have a different motivation. They worked in oil before, and now they want to do something good and invest in green energy. They have, compared to VC, maybe a little bit more patience. So if things don't work out immediately, they say, okay, I can wait a few more years, and I really hope I get my money back, maybe. But it's like definitely a really important aspect for the ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really encouraging that they're in it for the long haul, which I guess you need in this space because you're constantly balancing the priority of action now versus the fact that you're dealing with disruptive tech that takes a long time to build, right? You need a bit of patience there, huh?
Oh, yeah.
And so, you know, when I think Switzerland, I think tech, I think CERN, I think NIM, I think Proton, I think biotech. But tell me a bit about the sustainability ecosystem there. What are some things that, you know, we probably don't know here?
I mean, Switzerland is very deep tech, and like here's Oxford, Cambridge, and Switzerland is ETH and EPFL. These are the top universities in the world, like in the top 10, I think, all 4 of them. And they all have successful spin-offs. The level of engineering is really high. I mean, to give you an example, like I worked for Google, the biggest engineering office for Google outside of the US is in Switzerland, in Zurich. It's nowhere else in the world. And that creates a huge pool of incredible talents coming from big tech, with like the young guys coming from the universities and the big corporates. You have a similar setup here in London, and that creates like an incredible like development also for sustainability. Areas that I personally really like, there's some like Climeworks or Planted that are well known, that are already unicorns, but there's other areas like water, material science, where Switzerland has historically famous research institutes, and where you see like a startup I personally really like is Oxyle. They're removing PFAS from the water, and you see a lot of like combination lately from AI and hardware startups, because these are things that Switzerland has historically developed pretty well. And the government also sets the right like framework for it, like the support for universities, like, I don't know, leveraging AI capacity or getting access to a food lab for pretty much nothing. That makes a nice ground to see a lot of fantastic startups coming up. And there's a lot of early stage ones.
Yeah.
But like the next years, I think in Europe in general, will be quite interesting to see. Despite a little bit of the slowdown that we see now around sustainability, we'll see some great stories. And yeah, hiccups happen on the way, but that's part of the game.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds really promising, but one thing I'm hearing more about, murmurings about the last few months, is ESG and how we prioritize ESG, because we know traditionally in the last few years, a lot of startups in the green space have really prospered because they've had that opportunity from regulation. Regulation's coming in, therefore people have to comply, and it's a boost for a startup who wants to, you know, disrupt a space by creating, you know, providing a solution. What are your thoughts both on that? Maybe you could start, David.
Well, I think we will be much more careful to invest in companies that are dependent on regulatory frameworks for their success going forward, because it's apparently quite shaky. It can shift quite quickly. With that said, I think EU is still, so our next election is 2029, right? And Ursula von der Leyen and her team has said that we're going to keep on, you know, going straight forward on the sustainability path, and they're coming out with a Clean Industrial Act, etc. So Europe is still going to be a pretty good place, probably, but still we are going to be more careful with regulatory-dependent businesses.
What about you, Steffen? Any thoughts?
Very similar perspective. Like we are not recommending our angels to invest in startups that are built around regulation. I think right now that's actually also a great opportunity to reboot ESG and what it means, because it was the idea was great, but
Yeah.
how it was done was not perfect. And I think that's now like setting probably a nice foundation for V2 of ESG. That's also like for small and medium businesses, something that's easier to digest, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a good way forward, I guess. And David, I noticed you've launched Norrsken House in Brussels recently. And we know Brussels is kind of the land of regulation. Can you tell us a little bit about the thinking there?
Yeah, sure. So the idea, so Norrsken, there's a foundation on top, and then we have a bunch of investing vehicles, but then we also have these co-working spaces called Norrsken houses. And it's it's in Stockholm, it's in Kigali, it's in Barcelona, and now there's one in Brussels. And the idea is just to bring businesses to where the legislation is happening. I think, at least in Sweden, startups are notoriously bad at working with politicians. And I think the politicians are actually the most underestimated, like it might be the most hated working group. I mean, it's one of the few racisms that are still kind of okay to hate on politicians. But I think they are so important, and there is so much that they actually affect that people just underestimate, and therefore I think it makes a lot of sense to be closer to where the legislation happens, and that's the reason behind the Norrsken House in Brussels.
Yeah, fantastic. And we're going to be talking about politicians and regulation and startups tomorrow when we interview a member of EU Inc., who you might know and you can find all about tomorrow. But I'm interested to know from both of you, are there any sort of particular elements of the green tech sector that you're really kind of championing over the next few years? Maybe Steffen, you'd like to start?
I mean, like in the sustainability context, there are a couple of interesting sectors. Carbon was one of the first one. I tend to stay away from it a little bit because there was a lot of, I call it sometimes scam happening. I think what is really needed in the space in general is like the reality check with the capitalistic reality of the world. Like build businesses that make money and do good. And a lot of like startups I've seen are still like kind of in a call it research phase. They maybe build a great product, but it's like who's buying it? And if you really want to have an impact, it needs to scale, it needs to be big. And there's an obvious sector like energy that will continue to be important in the European context. You could argue, like in the context of like increasing attention to defense tech, energy will stay highly relevant. You could argue that other areas, it's just maybe a repositioning that needs to happen. It's just like with the drones, biodiversity monitoring, with circular economy, supply chain stability. So it's sometimes maybe a bit of like a repositioning that can change things. But I think the link to money is something that will naturally make it clear which sectors will win.
Yeah, great. And it sounds a bit like you created your own dual-use tech category there. That sounds pretty promising and interesting. How about you, David?
I think Steffen actually put it perfectly.
Yeah.
I don't have that much to add to it. Better, bigger, cheaper, faster, and like relying on capitalistic principles. I mean, yeah. I met an LP at the conference not long ago, and she was like really sad that everybody was just talking money. Because it used to be that in the sustainability, we talked a lot about other values that we want to do good with the world. But now that's almost like swearing in the church. You're not allowed to do that anymore. So now everybody's just talking about money. But with that said, I agree with you. Like I think that's where we're going. And I think a lot of the terminology that especially the US companies, we have US portfolio companies that just had to drop certain words from their websites and stuff because the administration came after them and they took away their money, the grants and the permits that they had, if they kept those words on the website and in their policy documents. So they had to change that, but of course they keep on doing the same thing, right? So instead of, like you're saying, instead of talking about energy transition or green energy, you talk about energy sovereignty or energy independence. But yeah, it's a weird world where you can't say that you want to do good because then people come after you.
I mean, it's one point to add here. I think it's also sometimes a misconception when you look into what happens in politics and what individual people think and do. And we see this on our end with angels and family offices. Yes, when they invest, they want to see this money back with a good return, but they also have a different motivation. They want to have impact, specifically like in younger generations. Like when we see like family offices, the younger generation that will take over, they would love to do also something good and do not necessarily invest in oil and other businesses. So it's like, it doesn't have to be, you have not to choose between one or the other together. I know it's sometimes hard to reach that, but I think when you can do both, then it becomes really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you expect to see much consolidation in this space of companies? Because we've seen a fairly broad range of companies over the last few years. Do you see that sort of changing?
I mean, I think it's healthy to have a bit of a consolidation, and like we come from a huge wave of growth. Like in Switzerland last year, people think about Switzerland like fintech and maybe chocolate and watches and so on. But like the number one vertical where startups came from was GreenTech last year in Switzerland. That is fantastic. It's great, and there will be incredible stories coming out of it. But it was also like a bit of an exaggerated growth, and now it's starting to shift a bit into the context of all the other verticals that are out there. So consolidation is good because it kind of forms like a certain mindset that is just like you have to think about being like humble, being like frugal, to set a great foundation for a business, and that really makes sense to grow further. So from that point of view, we see a couple of like startups shutting down, but I think they would have had a hard time before already to become big.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a lot of people, when they think sustainability, they think EVs, right? We know Tesla is facing its challenges in the US and probably elsewhere as well. Is this an opportunity for Europe in terms of the EV space? And would you invest in EVs as well?
We're heavily invested in Ehrhardt, which is an EV truck company.
Great company.
So that's a bit different. But I think so. The Chinese. I don't know if you've seen what the Chinese are doing on the EV side, but it's crazy.
It's fast.
It's fast. Like and the performance and the price and like on every metric they're just kicking it. So I don't know. Like that's going to be a really tough space. What I would not for sure not invest in is like lower tier. Cheaper model. Like, maybe go for like more exclusive ranges where you feel that maybe you want to, where you're buying a brand, maybe that. So maybe Rivian, but I wouldn't want to be Tesla now because they're competing for many reasons, but they're also competing at a price point where the Chinese are coming in with much better cars, much cheaper.
Yeah, BYD, for example.
BYD.
It's just surpassed them exponentially. Yeah. What about you? How much interest do you see in EVs and automotive, I guess, and perhaps batteries even in the angel space?
Yeah, I mean, in the angel space is not an obvious topic because it's like very much owned by big corporates. And I think like right now it's a great spot to be in for European car manufacturers. The number one sold electric vehicle in Europe is no longer a Tesla. I think it's a BMW, or I don't know. And they're all getting better. Like their batteries are better than they used to be in the last 1 or 2 years. And like consumers will and want to buy more like European brands. So from that point of view, I'm very optimistic. And on the like startup, like research and development side, I see a couple of really like high-end battery productions that are like super thin and like still extremely powerful. it's a normal like a cat and mouse game, I would say, where like Europe with all the researchers, universities, and the institutes is in a fantastic position to be leading the direction. And sure, they're great and doing a lot of stuff in Asia too, but I think we're in a good spot.
Fantastic. And that's a great moment, I guess, to finish our panel before we start with the pitching. Thank you both for being here today. Yeah. And we're going to bid farewell to David, who's got to catch a plane. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.